You're standing at the edge of the world, not metaphorically, literally. You've marched more than 12,000 miles from home. Behind you lie Macedonia, Greece, Persia, Egypt, Bactria, an entire world conquered and remade in your image. Your sandals have been replaced more times than you can count. Your men have been marching, fighting, bleeding, and dying for nearly a decade. Some no longer remember the smell of their homes, and now you're standing on the bank of the Hydaspes River in the northwest of what we today call India. And on the other side of that monsoon-swollen river, something is waiting for you that none of your soldiers have ever faced at this scale. You are Alexander. You are 29 years old. You have never lost a battle. And yet, as you look out over those dark and churning waters in the summer of 326 BC, something cold moves inside your chest. Something that isn't quite fear, because you have trained yourself beyond fear, but something close to it, the recognition of genuine danger. Because on the other side of the Hydaspes stands Porus, King Porus of the Pauravas, and Porus has brought infantry, cavalry, war chariots, and something your Macedonian veterans have faced before, but never in numbers like this, never in a formation like this. He has brought war elephants, hundreds of them, massive, armored, terrifying creatures. Creatures that turn horses into panicking animals the moment they catch their scent. Creatures that can shatter a phalanx that has never broken against any human enemy. And your own men, men who conquered everything between Greece and the edges of the known world, are staring across from the opposite bank with something unmistakable in their eyes. They are afraid, but this is not the battle they think they're fighting. By the end of this video, you'll understand not just how Alexander won at the Hydaspes, but why this battle was perhaps the greatest demonstration of his military genius across his entire career. Not simply because of the odds, not simply because of the elephants, but because of what he did before a single arrow was fired, before a single soldier crossed that river, in the darkness and the rain, with the patience of a man who understood that battles are won first in the mind. If you enjoy this kind of content, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Every subscriber helps this channel grow and makes it possible to keep bringing these stories to life. Alexander III of Macedon inherited a kingdom at 20, following the assassination of his father Philip II in 336 BC. Philip had been a military revolutionary, transforming Macedonia into a war machine. He developed the Macedonian phalanx, armed with the sarissa, a spear nearly 18 feet long that, wielded by disciplined soldiers in tight formation, created a wall of wood and iron that nothing in the ancient world could break head-on. He also created the companion cavalry, heavily armed riders of extraordinary skill who could be directed at the precise weak point of an enemy line and drive through it like a blade through silk. And then Philip was assassinated, and his son took everything he had built and did something even Philip had never dared to imagine. Alexander went east. He crossed into Persia, the greatest empire the world had ever known, and destroyed it. At the Granicus in 334 BC, at Issus in 333 BC, at Gaugamela in 331 BC, battle after battle, the Macedonian king read the field, found the gap, and hurled his cavalry like a thunderbolt at the enemy's heart. Darius III, the great king of Persia, fled twice and was murdered by his own men. The Achaemenid Empire, the largest political structure the ancient world had ever produced, ceased to exist, and Alexander looked east because he could not stop, because whatever fire had burned inside him since childhood, when he read the Iliad and wept that he had no Homer to sing his deeds, that fire had not been quenched by the fall of Persia. He pushed east through modern Afghanistan and Pakistan, fighting brutal guerrilla campaigns in the mountains that cost far more in blood and time than any of his set-piece battles. He crossed the Hindu Kush mountain range twice in conditions that killed men not through enemy action, but through cold and exhaustion. And in 326 BC, he reached the Indus River, crossed it, and advanced into the Punjab, the land of the 5 rivers. And there, at the Hydaspes, the second of those rivers, he found Porus. Who was Porus? The ancient sources give us an almost mythological physical description. They say he stood nearly 7.5 feet tall, that he carried himself with a natural dignity that even Alexander, who had faced emperors and satraps across a dozen countries, found remarkable. What is not in doubt is that Porus was a formidable commander, a proud and experienced king, and a man who had no intention of submitting to this foreign conqueror the way so many others had. He also chose his ground well. The Hydaspes in summer, fed by monsoon rains, was a dangerous river. Wide, fast-moving, full of eddies that could drag a man in armor under without a second thought. Crossing it by force, against an enemy waiting on the opposite bank in formation, with elephants, was not a military operation. It was a massacre waiting to happen. Porus knew this. He positioned his army along the southern bank, stretching his forces across the most likely crossing points, keeping his war elephants at the front where Alexander's horses would see them, smell them, and refuse to advance. On paper, he could not lose. Alexander looked at all of this and began to think. What followed was a masterpiece of psychological warfare that lasted weeks before a single blow was struck. Alexander understood the problem with brutal clarity. He could not cross the river during daylight at the obvious fords because Porus would be waiting, and the elephants would destroy his cavalry before it could form up on the southern bank. He could not simply wait, because his supply lines were stretched and the monsoon rains were not going to stop, and the longer he waited, the higher the river rose. He needed to cross that river. He needed to do it without being destroyed in the crossing. And he needed to do it against an enemy who was alert, experienced, and defending with every geographical advantage. So he decided to wear Porus down. Night after night, Alexander's cavalry began moving along the northern bank of the river. Moving with noise, the kind of noise an army marching to cross a river makes. Horses, voices, the clinking of equipment, the sound of preparations. And every night, Porus would mobilize his forces on the southern bank and march to meet them, elephants and all, exhausting his animals and his men, responding to what turned out to be false alarms. Night after night after night, the Macedonians would move. Porus would respond. No crossing would come. And after enough nights of this, Porus began to wonder. Were these real preparations, or more of the same? His men were tired. His elephants were restless. The rain was relentless. Porus stopped mobilizing his full force for every alarm. Of course he did. Any rational commander would have made the same decision. You cannot keep an army at full combat readiness indefinitely on the basis of threats that never materialize. Porus made the reasonable choice, and Alexander had been waiting for him to make exactly that choice. Approximately 17 miles upriver from the main Macedonian camp, scouts had identified something valuable. A bend in the river where a densely wooded island sat in the middle of the current, splitting the crossing into two narrower channels, providing cover for a moving force and breaking the flow enough to make the crossing survivable. The forest on the northern bank was dense enough to conceal a significant contingent of troops during daylight hours. And the monsoon rains masked the noise of a large formation moving in the dark. Alexander made his plan. He would leave his general Craterus at the main camp with a substantial force, enough to look like the entire army and to actually cross if the opportunity presented itself. And he himself, in the dead of a stormy night, would take the best of his troops, including the companion cavalry, the royal Hydaspes, the elite soldiers of his army, the Agranian javelin-men, the horse archers, and selected battalions of the phalanx, and march them silently through the rain to that bend in the river 17 miles upstream, and cross. The night he chose was exactly the right night. A violent storm swept through the Punjab, the kind that turns the sky white with lightning and fills every sound with thunder. The rain fell in curtains. The river churned. And in that darkness and noise, Alexander moved his force along the northern bank, hugging the tree line, moving with the kind of discipline that only an army that has campaigned together for nearly a decade can maintain on a night like that, when it is dark and wet and cold and the river is roaring and the man beside you is invisible and you are trusting your training, your officers, and the plan of the one man who has never, not once, led you into a battle from which you did not emerge. Victorious, they reached the island. They began to cross. The boats Alexander had ordered prepared in the weeks prior were brought up. His men began boarding them in hide-covered rafts stuffed with hay. The crossing was not easy. The current was ferocious. Some boats were swept off course. Men fought with oars in water that wanted nothing more than to swallow them, but they crossed. Through the thunder and lightning and curtains of rain, Alexander's strike force crossed the Hydaspes, and then, almost immediately, a complication. On the opposite bank, they discovered that what they thought was the far shore was actually a second island. There was another channel to cross, shallower but more delay, more time for the storm to pass and dawn to arrive and Porus to realize what was happening. Alexander's men waded through the shallows, the cavalry controlling their horses, the infantry moving in formation through thigh-deep water, and emerged on the southern bank of the Hydaspes, in Porus's territory, as the first gray light of dawn began to erode the darkness. Porus's scouts saw them. Of course they did. No deception lasts forever, and Alexander had never expected this one to. Porus sent his son with a force of cavalry and war chariots to deal with Alexander's landing force before it could fully organize on the bank. It was a reasonable response. The problem was that young Porus arrived with a force that was substantial but nowhere near sufficient. The war chariots, magnificent on dry ground, were useless on the waterlogged, muddy riverbank after a night of monsoon rain. They bogged down in the mud, lost formation, became liabilities instead of weapons. And Alexander had already formed his cavalry on the bank. The fight for the riverbank was brief and one-sided. Alexander led his cavalry personally. Porus's son was killed in the fighting. The war chariots were destroyed or captured. The survivors fled back to the main army with simple and devastating news. Alexander had crossed with a large force, and they had failed to stop him. Now Porus had to commit. He left a small force of elephants and infantry to block Craterus's crossing at the main ford, which would successfully hold Craterus back for the entirety of the main battle, the elephants alone preventing Craterus's horses from entering the river. And with the rest of his army, he marched north to face Alexander. Porus was not panicking. He was not fleeing. He had lost his son in the preliminary skirmish, and his army knew it, and he was still marching north to fight. He was a warrior king in the most literal sense of the ancient world, a man who led from the front, who sat atop his great war elephant and directed the battle from a height that allowed him to see the entire field. And he organized his army with the tactical intelligence of someone who had spent his entire life studying war. Porus placed his infantry in the center, a dense line of foot soldiers on a front wide enough to anchor his flanks. In front of the infantry, at intervals, he placed his war elephants, spaced roughly 100 feet apart, creating a wall of massive armored flesh that would terrify Alexander's cavalry horses and break the momentum of any charge. On the flanks, he placed his cavalry with his war chariots mixed in. It was a strong formation. It was a formation designed to neutralize Alexander's primary weapon, the shock cavalry charge, by making the center inaccessible to horses and forcing any cavalry engagement out to the flanks. Alexander looked at this formation and saw it for what it was. Porus had built his line to stop precisely the kind of attack that had destroyed Darius at Gaugamela. The oblique advance, the hammer of the companion cavalry driving through a gap in the center while the phalanx fixed the enemy line, would not work here. There was no gap in the center. There were only elephants. So Alexander changed his approach. He took his cavalry and concentrated most of it on his left flank under his general Conus, giving Conus specific and detailed instructions about what to do and when to do it. He kept the bulk of his own companion cavalry with him on the right. He advanced his infantry phalanx in the center, but ordered it not to engage the elephants directly. Not yet. Present as a threat, but do not commit. The plan was not to destroy the center. The plan was to make Porus respond to threats from multiple directions simultaneously, and in responding to each of them, expose himself to something he could not respond to. Alexander advanced on the right with his cavalry, threatening Porus's left flank. Porus, watching from atop his elephant, saw this and did the natural thing. He began moving cavalry from his right flank around behind his infantry to reinforce the left. This was logical. It was what any competent commander would have done. What Porus did not realize was that it was exactly what Alexander wanted him to do. Because the moment Porus's right flank cavalry began moving to reinforce the left, Conus moved. Conus took his cavalry force and swept around and behind Porus's army, appearing suddenly on the right flank and rear of precisely the cavalry that was in the process of moving to reinforce the left. Porus's cavalry found itself caught between two hammer blows, Alexander's companions pressing from the front left, and Conus striking from behind on the right. The Macedonian cavalry was better trained, better organized, riding in coordinated formations, while the Indian riders, now confused and attacked from two directions, lost cohesion and began to fragment. They advance, arrows fall, the line bends, but still it holds. The cavalry battle on the flanks went badly for Porus quickly. His riders were pushed back toward the center, losing the ability to threaten the Macedonian flanks. And now Alexander's phalanx, the Sarissa-armed killing machine that had destroyed every infantry force in the world, began its advance in the center. Now the elephants came forward. Now the real horror began. The war elephants of Porus's army crashed into the Macedonian line, and the damage was real. The Hydaspes and phalangists who faced them did not break. These were Alexander's veterans, men who had seen everything the world could throw at them. But they suffered. Elephants seized men with their trunks and hurled them to the ground. They trampled. They pushed. They turned the precise mathematical geometry of the phalanx into something more confused and desperate. But Alexander had prepared for this. He had developed specific counter-instructions over years of campaigning. Target the mahouts, the riders who controlled the animals. Cut at the feet, because elephants have sensitive feet. Use javelins. Use the lighter troops, the Agrians especially, who could move quickly and throw with precision. Make the elephants uncomfortable, confused, and above all, do not give them a stationary, dense target to push against. Give them space. Let them advance into gaps. Surround them. The Macedonian infantry began deliberately opening its formation, creating corridors between units, allowing the elephants to advance into those spaces and then closing around them, attacking from the sides and rear. The elephants, now unsupported by cavalry on either flank, with no clear targets to destroy because the Macedonian infantry was spreading and moving rather than holding rigid formation, began to turn. Wounded, confused, their mahouts dead, they began moving backward. And there is nothing in ancient battle more dangerous to everyone than a herd of panicking war elephants turning in the middle of a formation. Porus's own infantry suffered terribly as the elephants they had relied upon as their greatest weapon became a catastrophe, pressing back through their own ranks. The collapse came not all at once, but in pieces, the way real military collapses always happen. Not a single moment when everything changed. A series of moments, each slightly worse than the last. The cavalry gone from both flanks, the elephants turning, the infantry now pressed from the front by the Macedonian phalanx, from the flanks by the cavalry that had completed its work and was now sweeping inward. Craterus's force finally crossing the main ford behind them. Porus fought to the end. He was still on his elephant when the battle was over, still upright, still directing what remained of his forces, bleeding from wounds that must have been significant given the scale of the combat around him. He was surrounded, he was alone, and he had not surrendered. Alexander sent messenger after messenger. Porus ignored them or waved them away, until a man named Meroes, someone Porus knew personally and trusted, was sent to him and told him that Alexander himself was asking Porus to come and speak with him. And only then did Porus guide his elephant forward. What happened next became one of the most celebrated moments in the legend of Alexander. The two men faced each other, Alexander on horseback, Porus still elevated on his great war elephant. And Alexander asked how he wished to be treated. And Porus, wounded, defeated, his army destroyed, his son dead, gave an answer that the ancient sources agree upon almost word for word. He said, as a king. Alexander looked at him for a long moment, and then he gave Porus his kingdom back. Not just his kingdom as it was, but expanded, because Alexander had fought enough men to recognize when he had fought a great one, and because he understood that a proud man willing to die rather than submit could be an obstacle or an ally depending entirely on how you treated him in the moment of his defeat. He made Porus a satrap, an ally, a king under Alexander's supreme authority, but a real king with real power in his own territory. And Porus, who had fought him to his last breath, served him faithfully from that day forward. The Hydaspes was Alexander's last great set-piece battle, not because he could not win more, but because what came after the Hydaspes was something that no military genius could solve with cavalry and phalanx and psychological warfare. What came after was his own army. His soldiers had marched and fought for nearly 9 years. And after the Hydaspes, when Alexander tried to cross the next river, the Hydaspes, to continue east toward the heart of India, his men stopped. They sat down on the banks of a river and refused to move. Not a violent mutiny, something quieter and more final. His officers came to him one by one and told the truth they had perhaps been carrying for years. The men were finished. They wanted to go home. They missed their families, their children growing up without them, the smell of their own land in spring. Conus, the same general who had executed the decisive cavalry maneuver at the Hydaspes, spoke for the army and made it clear that it would march no further east. Alexander was furious. He reportedly stayed in his tent for 3 days, refusing to see anyone, waiting to see if anyone would change their mind. No one did. And for the first time in his life, Alexander the Great accepted a limit. The army turned around. He would never fight a battle like the Hydaspes again. He would return by the southern route, fighting brutal campaigns where he nearly died several times, and make his way back to Babylon, the city he had chosen as the capital of his empire. And there, in 323 BC, at just 32 years old, he died. The cause of death remains one of history's greatest unsolved mysteries. Fever is the standard answer. Typhoid fever, complicated by excessive alcohol consumption, is the most modern clinical assessment. Poison is what some of his contemporaries believed. Whatever it was, it took him quickly and left behind an empire so vast and so personally tied to him that it did not survive his death by more than a single generation. But the Hydaspes stands apart from everything else, even within a career built of military masterpieces. Because at Gaugamela, at Issus, at the Granicus, Alexander had exploited the weaknesses of Persian tactical doctrine. At the Hydaspes, he faced something different. He faced a commander who understood him, who had built a defense specifically designed to neutralize what made Alexander dangerous. Porus had studied how Alexander fought and created a response, and Alexander won anyway, not by throwing more force at it, but by making Porus's own response to his threats become the mechanism of Porus's defeat. The Hydaspes was not Alexander at his most reckless or his most personally heroic. It was Alexander at his most brilliant. It was the battle that showed, more clearly than any other, the distance between a great general and the greatest general who had lived up to that point in history. And there is something more about the Hydaspes that goes beyond tactics and campaign strategy. The fact that in Porus, Alexander had finally met a man similar enough to himself to see the difference. Porus understood limits in a way Alexander never did, and perhaps that is precisely why Alexander admired him so deeply. The Hydaspes was Alexander's greatest victory. It was also the beginning of the end of everything he had built, not because of what he lost there, but because of what the men who followed him could finally see clearly from that distant bank of a rain-soaked Indian river, that he would never stop, that there was no final victory, that the horizon always moved, and that their king would follow it until it killed him, and they did not need to go any further. But there is a story that comes immediately after the Hydaspes that changes everything you think you know about what happened when Alexander finally turned west. A story about a city whose name means nothing to most people today, but where Alexander made a decision so reckless that even by his extraordinary standards it stands alone. A city where he leaped from the walls alone into a mass of enemies, where his men believed for a few terrible minutes that he was already dead, and where what happened next forced him to reckon with whether he himself was something more than human, or whether the arrow buried in his chest was the universe's answer to that question. That battle is coming, and it will change everything you've seen before.